On the chilly morning of September 10, 1987, fog hung thick outside the South Yorkshire Police Headquarters, like a dead skin covering the sleepy city. In the small interrogation room, fluorescent lights flickered, casting a yellowish glow across the cold metal table. Policeman Dick Ellis opened the door, stepping inside as if he were cutting through a thick layer of fog that was not only outside but also inside the place. The air in the room was thick, not from cigarette smoke, but from something invisible that hovered haunting, silent, murderous. Sitting across from him were two burly men, Stephen Brooks and David Goldthorpe, security guards at the old industrial complex. But now they were no longer guards, they were living witnesses to something beyond reason. Their faces were pale, sweat dripping despite the cold room. Stephen's hands were still shaking slightly, his nails scratching the tabletop with each rapid breath. David was staring at his reflection on the floor, eyes wide but lifeless. Ellis hadn't pulled out a chair yet. He hadn't opened his mouth yet. He hadn't touched any of the reports yet. Stephen half sat up, his voice cracking like metal being bent. "We didn't do anything wrong. You have to believe me. It's not human." The room fell silent for a second. The wind whistled softly through the closed window. And Ellis knew this morning would not be just an interrogation, but the beginning of a very real nightmare. The two guards began to speak in trembling voices, as if the memories still clung to them like the cold dust of death. It was the night shift. The construction site was as silent as a graveyard that had just buried an ancient secret. The Stocksbridge bypass, 6 miles of unfinished concrete, spanning the moors where witches had been executed, lay motionless under a black sky. All the workers had left at dusk. No more hammers, no more lights. It was just them, and the silence was soul-sucking. Then the clock struck midnight. The wind picked up, not in one direction. A cold chill ran down the backs of their necks like a gentle hand. And then they saw it on the unfinished span where no one could stand. A figure appeared, tall, thin, standing as if nailed to the void, wearing what looked like a dull gray cloak caked with dust and mud. The wind blew through him, but the hem did not move. His face was turned into darkness. "Or no face," Stephen whispered. "It's not human. It can't be human." David raised the flashlight, his hand shaking. The light hit and threw the figure onto the cold concrete. They froze, not breathing, not moving, until the shadow began to move toward them. No steps, no sound, just sliding forward like a nightmare, bleeding from fake cracks of reality. One of the guards shouted, his voice caught in his throat. "Who's there?" "This is a restricted area." No response. Only the wind blowing through the steel beams and cold concrete, echoing like a whisper from the grave. Stephen raised the flashlight, his hand shaking, and pointed it at the figure. The beam cut through it as if into fog. No skin, no clothes, just a blurry shape gray as ash standing still, facing the light as if unaffected by the light or by reality. Then it slowly turned its head, not with a muscular movement, but with a twist, a snap, like a dislocated neck. A high-pitched sound rang in their heads, like fingernails scraping rusty metal. No one screamed. They couldn't scream. David felt a weight on his chest, as if something invisible were looking through him, through all his memories. A primal terror, innate, nameless, wordless, strangled their hearts. And then it took a step toward them. No sound, no ground. They ran. Across the deserted structure, their feet pounding on the concrete like drums. Behind them, no footsteps, just the feeling of being followed every breath at the back of their necks. When they reached the police station, they rushed in like men emerging from a tomb, their faces white, their mouths stuttering, unable to form words. Ellis pursed his lips, his eyes sweeping over the two faces still pale with fear. "Ghosts? Never mind," he muttered, tossing the pen down on the table. "You should go to church. Maybe the priest will be able to exorcise those vague apparitions from your heads." Without waiting for a response, Ellis stood up, pulled the door open, and dismissed them with a bland nod. The two guards walked out, heavy as if each step dragged something invisible, haunting them like a shadow from somewhere they dared not name. Ellis returned to the table, refilling his coffee cups. The overhead light flickered, then flickered. Something in the room felt off. "Ghosts," he repeated, chuckling to himself. "It must be a hoax." At that moment, the phone rang screeching in the slowly thickening air. Ellis. He picked up, his voice hoarse. On the other end was his superior, his voice unusually urgent. "Dick, those two guards. They went to Street Bartholomew's. Lock the door from the inside, praying non-stop, they said." He followed them. Wouldn't leave. They wouldn't say another word, just cried and whispered that the cross in the church was bleeding. Ellis stood still. Outside the glass window, the morning mist had thickened unnaturally, obscuring all vision. From a distance, in that mist, he thought he saw a figure, standing still, looking in. That night, Ellis and his men quietly set up ambush at the foot of the unfinished bridge. The lights were off. They sat in the dark, surrounded by the soft howling of the wind and the steady beating of their hearts. Nothing happened. An uneasy silence, as if there had never been life here. Then movement. On the upper span of the bridge, a figure passed by like a shadow breaking away from itself. No shape, no outline. Just the feeling that something was looking down. Ellis held his breath. His eyes blinked repeatedly, as if to clear the vision. "There's someone up there," he whispered, his hand on the flashlight, but not turning it on. The metal steps were cold under his hands as he began to climb the ladder to the bridge's surface. Each clink echoed as if from the depths of a grave. The higher he climbed, the thicker the air became, damp with the smell of rust and something else, something rotten. He stopped as he neared the edge of the bridge. A soft thud sounded above, like a foot missing a step. His heart pounded. The flashlight turned on, pointing at empty space. No one. But the surface of the sphere still shook slightly. Someone or something had just stood there and disappeared. A cold wind blew down, carrying hoarse breathing close to his ear. Ellis walked slowly across the cold bridge, his flashlight scanning the darkness. There was no one, just a dirty, crumpled tarp, loosely draped over a pile of rusted construction equipment. In the pale moonlight, it swayed as if it were breathing like a body, writhing under a shroud. Ellis frowned. His breath made a wisp of smoke in the chill air. He stepped closer, his hand brushing the edge of the tarp. The plastic was Kolb's skin's kin. "Just a trick of the wind," he muttered, but his voice was hoarse. Then he pulled the edge back. Underneath was only equipment. Old, dusty. But then there was a soft click behind him, like a foot hitting a bar. Ellis spun around. Nothing. He turned toward the tarp. It had moved as if someone had just thrust a hand inside. The flashlight in his hand flickered, then went out for a second. And in that instant, a face appeared, pale, eyes as empty as bottomless black holes. Just a few feet away from him, just across the tarp, the light came back on. The face was gone. The tarp was silent. Ellis stood still. His pulse pounded in his ears like a drum. Behind him, a slow, drawn-out scraping of metal sounded, like someone dragging their fingernails along a bar. This time he didn't turn around. Ellis walked slowly across the cold bridge, his flashlight scanning the darkness. There was no one, just a dirty, crumpled tarp, loosely draped over a pile of rusted construction equipment. In the pale moonlight, it swayed as if it were breathing like a body, writhing under a shroud. Ellis frowned. His breath made a wisp of smoke in the chill air. He stepped closer, his hand brushing the edge of the tarp. The plastic was Kolb's skin, just a trick of the wind, he muttered, but his voice was hoarse. Then he pulled the edge back. Underneath was only equipment, old, dusty. But then there was a soft click behind him, like a foot hitting a bar. Ellis spun around. Nothing. He turned toward the tarp. It had moved as if someone had just thrust a hand inside. The flashlight in his hand flickered, then went out for a second. And in that instant, a face appeared, pale, eyes as empty as bottomless black holes. Just a few feet away from him, just across the tarp, the light came back on. The face was gone. The tarp was silent. Ellis stood still. His pulse pounded in his ears like a drum. Behind him, a slow, drawn-out scraping of metal sounded, like someone dragging their fingernails along a bar. This time he didn't turn around. Ellis screamed, the scream tearing through the silence as if something inside him had snapped. He threw open the door, leaping out of the patrol car, eyes darting wildly around, heart pounding as if it were being squeezed from within. No one, not a soul, but the cold still clung to him like flesh touched by death. Behind him the passenger door opened. His friend, a tough, experienced man, stepped out, his face ashen, his lips parted but no sound came out. After a while he could only say a few words, each dragging through his dry throat. I saw it too. He crouched, right next to the window, old-fashioned trench coat, and he raised his head and looked straight at Ellis. His eyes panicked as if he had just seen an abyss. No face. No face. Where the face should have been was a black hole, bottomless, as if all light, all life, had been sucked into it. A void so deep that one could not only see it, but also feel its cruel emptiness penetrating one's mind. Ellis felt the darkness breathing on the back of his neck, a chill running down his spine. The space around him was empty, but his intuition screamed that the creature was still there watching, waiting. They returned to the car, not saying a word. Each screech of tires on the road seemed to echo from afar, as if the road itself did not want to keep them there any longer. When they reached the station, they avoided eye contact with others, sat down quietly, their hands shaking so much they could barely hold a pen. In the report, hastily scrawled, "Encountered unidentified entity, dressed in 19th century clothing, no face, no eyes, no mouth, feeling of being seen through, need to verify paranormal phenomena." But Ellis knew no one believed him. And worse, he was still out there somewhere. A few months later, the new bypass, the Stocksbridge Bypass, opened. Under the cold sodium lights, the road was a long black silk, lifeless and perfect. But the silence did not last long. An accident occurred, and then another. Then a string of deadly collisions began to grow in numbers. Cars rolled over in the night, muffled screams carried by broken glass and twisted bloody metal. The police listed the causes as loss of control, fog, speed, the usual suspects. But no one could explain the repeated accounts of survivors or unwitting witnesses. I saw him. On the bridge. A black shape. Standing still. With no face. They said the headlights passed right through him, casting no shadow, no reflection. Just a hole in reality. As if the darkness itself had gathered into a human shape. Rumors spread. Some said that in the process of building the bridge, workers had dug up an ancient burial ground, burying unidentified bodies beneath dead people who had no one to remember. There were whispers of a spirit awakened, tormented, now wandering the new asphalt, groping for a way home that would never be found. No proof, no confirmation, just more blood, more death, and that shadow still standing, unmoving. It had been built to connect two cities, but now it was a rift between the world of the living and something that no longer belonged there. Now, decades later, the legend lives on a faint crack in Yorkshire memory. The seasoned policeman shivering in the night, the two tall guards unable to stand with fear, and the faceless figure, the nameless embodiment of silent death. The bridge is still there. Now, decades later, the legend lives on a faint crack in Yorkshire memory. The seasoned policeman shivering in the night, the two tall guards unable to stand with fear, and the faceless figure, the nameless embodiment of silent death. The bridge is still there, silent, open to all traffic, like a gaping mouth waiting for the next prey. The deaths still dripping like blood from a wound that will never heal. Some try to reason. Strong winds, faulty design, bad weather. They carry reason as a shield against the incomprehensible. But others, those who have driven past in the middle of the night when the headlights go out for no reason, or the radio whispers in a voice not of this time, believe otherwise. They whisper he is still there, without eyes, but he sees, he does not kill, but he makes them walk to their deaths. The bridge does not cross the earth, but the boundary of reality. No one can prove it, no one can deny it. Only the road, silent, as a grave still swallows each lonely soul. If you pass Stocksbridge at midnight, keep your eyes on the left lane, because sometimes something is there not to cross, but to wait for you. May 28, 2022. In the rotting heart of Flint, Michigan, where dreams had rotted decades earlier, an abandoned funeral home sat lurking like a cursed tomb, swallowing every stray gaze. The cracked brick walls, gray with age, weighed down as if they were bearing the burden of something that had never been buried. The air around it was thick with the smell of rot, ash, and a lingering trace of unsettled death. The once solemn facade was now like the skin of a corpse, chiseled, moldy, with cracks like burst veins. The dark windows were like empty eye sockets, staring into the night as if waiting for something or someone to return from beyond. A lonely street lamp nearby flickered erratically, emitting a muffled cry, making the space around it seem to shudder between two heartbeats, life and death. In that fading light, the funeral home appeared like a ghost heavy with time, a place where silence was not emptiness, but a trapped scream. No one remembered the name of this place, but it remembered everyone who had ever passed through its doors. Locals called it cursed. Its doors, sealed by rust and time, hadn't opened in decades. Yet some swore they saw shadows glide past shattered windows, or heard the faint creak of wheels like a gurney echoing at midnight. Stray cats refused to cross the lot. Birds never perched on its roof. No one lived there, but the building remembered every body it ever held, and it was always hungry for one more. A photographer named April Verrucci, along with two companions, crept silently through the darkness, toward the back door of the funeral home. They didn't say a word, not because they were afraid of being discovered, but because the sound of their voices might awaken something sleeping inside. They knew This was trespassing. But what drew them in wasn't just curiosity. It was a strange urge, as if an invisible gaze was whispering, inviting them to enter. Under the dying streetlights, their every movement was like a ghost lurking in the night. Their footsteps slid lightly across the damp cobblestones, but each small crack sounded like a bone breaking in the thick darkness. They could feel the eyes of passing cars, not the drivers, but the rearview mirrors themselves, reflecting something that didn't belong to this world. April's heart pounded in her chest like a drum. With each step closer to the rotting wooden door, the air around her became thicker cold, stuffy and filled with the stench of metal and rotting flesh. No one spoke. No one bothered to ask again, "Are we sure we want to go in?" Because deep down, they all knew the answer. April reached out to touch the doorknob, the cold metal as if someone had held it not long ago. She gently turned it. No creak, no resistance. The door opened with a soft groan, as if it had been waiting for them all along. A cold breath immediately filled their throats, sweeping down their throats like a breath from hell. The stench assaulted their nostrils, a mixture of rotten wood, time-worn corpses, and something else unnameable, fishy, seeping into their flesh. Her heart pounding, April took a deep breath, trying to suppress a shiver. As an avid explorer of abandoned cities, she had been to many strange places, but none had ever made her feel like she was crossing the boundary between two worlds. Her flashlight beamed inside the walls were mottled. Old bloodstains had turned a dark brown like ink. Everything stood still, covered in dust, as if sealed by time itself, as if this place had once lived, and then died suddenly, in a moment no one had witnessed. April swallowed. She had found the next subject for her lens. A world left behind. A moment of death, petrified forever. They stepped silently through the doorway, as if crossing the boundary between reality and oblivion. The flashlight in their hands wavered, cutting thin streaks of light into the dense darkness that contracted like a living thing. Silent, watching, waiting. A long hallway appeared before them, stretching endlessly like the entrails of a dead animal. The concrete walls, covered in white paint, peeling off in patches like flesh peeling off bones, were mottled in the dim light. This place was not just abandoned, it was abandoned, rejected by time itself. There was complete silence. No wind, no breathing. There was only a silence that weighed heavily on their chests, as if the air had been sucked clean of something inhuman. Their footsteps echoed, echoing unevenly, unnaturally long, as if there were more than 3 people walking. They stopped, motionless. The flashlight beam was pointed straight at the darkness ahead. The space suddenly seemed to contract, thick and cold. Then, a very small sound, like the sound of cloth rubbing against the wall, or the soft breathing of someone trying to hold their breath in a dark corner. They didn't call out to each other. There was no need. Each of them felt they were no longer alone. April stopped in front of a heavy iron door, rusted and streaked with dried blood. On its warped surface, a yellowed metal sign stood out in the darkness. "Warning, formaldehyde." The bold letters screamed at her, though they made no sound. April's heartbeat suddenly pounded in her ears, like a distant drumbeat. On the other side of that door was the embalming room, a place that had once received cold bodies, where death was delayed by chemicals, and sometimes by secrets that could never be brought to light. The air around her suddenly thickened, the stale smell of chemicals lingering in her every breath, pungent, throat aching, as if just stepping in was enough to make her lungs constrict. She felt a cold air seeping from the crack in the door. Not wind, but the breath of a place that had once held hundreds of bodies. A place where time had stopped. But something had not yet fallen asleep. Part of her whispered, "Turn away." But another part, deeper, darker, screamed, "Open the door." Her lens had waited a lifetime for this moment. And she didn't know if she would find the final image or if she would be a part of it. They entered. The door closed behind them with a heavy click, like the latch of a tomb. The space before them was flooded with flickering flashlight light, revealing patches of a nightmarish scene. In the center of the room, a stainless steel gurney stood alone, cold, alone, as if still waiting for the last body to be brought up. Its surface was mottled with strange corrosion, as if chemicals had pitted flesh and bone and memory. Around it were rusted metal shelves, stacked with surgical instruments, scalpels, handsaws, blood forceps, and glass vials filled with dark liquid murky, like blood mixed with fog. Some of the bottles had no labels, their contents thick and viscous, swaying silently with the movement of the light. On the floor, pieces of embalming cloth lay scattered like sloughed snakes. They were soggy, dark, sticky, each one still bearing the imprint of the body that had once wrapped around it. The smell wasn't just formaldehyde. It was the smell of dead flesh, held too long, mixed with confusion, dampness, and something deeper, a primal, visceral fear, as if the spirit had never left. April covered her mouth, but her breath still trembled. No one spoke, because they all sensed it. Death was no longer trapped here. It was watching. Forgetting their initial anxiety, a strange excitement rose within them, a feeling half fascinated, half threatening, as if the building itself were opening itself up to them. April and her friends wandered through the crumbling hallways, each step seeming to sink deeper into a world that time had abandoned. They found an old chapel covered in dust, its cracked ceiling seemingly collapsing at any moment. Rotten wooden coffins lay scattered about, some with their lids ajar, empty inside, but lined with dark, moldy cloth, as if it had been soaked through bodies that had never been laid to rest. The pews swayed, the saints on the altar cracked, their drooping faces melted into despair. Outside, they pushed through waist-high weeds to a detached garage, where the shutters squeaked like the sighs of a forgotten soul. Inside, a rusted hearse sat motionless in the darkness. The windshield was fogged with dust and fingerprints, more than a couple. The back door was ajar, as if someone had just gotten out or was about to get back in. Every room, every corner of the wall was tinged with the color of mourning. Not just a burial ground, but a place where memories were buried alive, suffocated and never released. The rotting walls seemed to whisper, telling the horrors of what had happened not in words, but in the chill of their spines, in the smell of dead time, and in the invisible eyes that followed them every step of the way. After 30 minutes of wandering silently through decaying hallways and rooms, like the hollow eye sockets of the dead, they returned to the same path, tired, but more uneasy than ever. And then they saw it, a door, plain, unmarked, tucked into the corner of the hallway, as if it had always been there but somehow hidden from view. The door opened, revealing a pitch-black crevice. Beyond, a narrow staircase of permeable concrete led down to where there was no light to the basement. The flashlight beam illuminated the first few steps before it was swallowed by the darkness. The smell from below was damp and rancid, like rusted iron, like dried blood, like clay mixed with death. The air was different, heavy, thick, something very small, like the light scratching of nails on cement, sounded from below. The staircase seemed more than inviting. It whispered, tugged, waited. An invitation that could not be refused, not by reason, but by a primal instinct, to face, or be swallowed. April tightened her grip on the flashlight. Neither spoke. They just looked at each other, and then began to descend, step by step, into the bosom of something that had been asleep, and was now waking. April stayed upstairs, the camera in her hand heavier than usual, as if its soul were protesting against each click. The two friends disappeared silently into the darkness of the basement stairs, where their flashlights could only illuminate a few steps, then were completely swallowed. She stood alone in the crumbling hallway, where time seemed to have stopped. The silence returned, so thick it was almost touching a silence that was not peaceful, but of anticipation, of holding one's breath, of waiting. April looked up from the viewfinder. She felt something was wrong, though she couldn't name it. No wind, no footsteps, just the absolute absence of life. Then suddenly, a noise came from the basement. At first it was a muffled sound, like someone speaking through thick fabric. Then it quickly turned into a panicked whisper, a human voice, but trembling, broken, distorted as if it had been crushed by the place itself. A muffled scream, a broken sentence, indistinct, but filled with instinctive fear, as if they had seen something that could not be seen. April froze. The echoes from the basement continued, as if coming from the mouth of the building itself. And down there, something else was clearly present. No footsteps, no movement, only something was waking. April raced down the stairs as if something were chasing her in the darkness. The steps creaked under her feet, not just with age, but as if in warning. When she reached the bottom, her two friends stood there, frozen, their flashlights shaking in their hands, casting undulating shadows on the walls. Then April saw it, a huge metal cage, at least 8 feet tall, rusted into every bar, but still standing as if rooted to the very foundation of the building. It had no walls, no wheels, no windows, just a cold, inexplicable mass, sitting in the middle of the basement as if it had always been there, since before the house was built. The light traced the inside wall of the cage where there were deep, crooked scratches, as if nails or claws had been worn down to the bone in desperation. There were dark, dried patches of slime stuck to the bars, and a strong, indescribable smell, half rotting flesh, half decomposing formaldehyde. April took a half step back, her throat closing. A friend stammered, Who would lock something up here?" No one answered, but they all stared into the dark void inside the cage, and all three of them sensed the same thing. It wasn't really empty. Inside the rusted cage was a cold, bare metal box, set in the cracked concrete floor. It had no handles, no hinges, just a square as if sealed. The ceiling above it had been hollowed out, leaving a gaping black hole like the mouth of a dry well, a void waiting for something to be pulled up or down. April took a half step back. Her breath condensed into smoke, though the air wasn't cold. Something was wrong. Too still, too deliberate. And then the realization hit her, colder than any wind. This cage wasn't for holding the living. It wasn't a torture chamber. It wasn't a cage. It was part of a ritual. The box, the coffin, and the opening in the ceiling were a mechanism for lifting corpses from the basement to the light. But the iron cage around it? It was unlike any mortuary apparatus April had ever seen. No, it was built to keep something from coming back. She stared at the box. A faint scratch appeared on the metal, like a fingernail scratching from the inside. They saw it, not a trick of the dark, Not imagination, but something real. Too real. Too wrong to exist in this world. April staggered back, her mouth open but no sound came out. Her eyes were fixed on the creature or relic, or living remains, that was curled up in the corner of the iron cage. It didn't look at them, but it knew they were there. And they knew it knew. A small movement, a mechanical movement, like that of a controlled corpse, sent all three of them into a burst of pure terror. No one said a word. They ran, stumbled, pulled themselves back up and ran. Screams tore through the rotten hallway. Each step echoed like a warning from the building itself. The bricks beneath their feet seemed to swallow them. The walls seemed to shrink. When they flung open the rotten door and ran out into the night, the cold air hit them like they had escaped a coffin buried alive. April, her hands shaking, called 911. Her voice was choked with sobs. We saw something in the basement. Please, come quick, before it follows us up here. When the police broke through the basement, the stench of death rose up, thick as mud. When the police broke through the basement, the stench of death rose up thick as mud. They shone flashlights into the cage and stopped. No one said a word. Inside the rusted cell lay a man who had been dead for at least 6 days. His skin was ashen, his eyes wide and lifeless, his mouth frozen in a final scream. His bony arms were still stretched forward, his fingernails scratching the cement floor. Just inches from his fingertips was a battered old phone, its screen broken, its flashlight still flickering faintly, like a forgotten cry for help. Above there was a square hole in the ceiling. It wasn't just a cage, it was the shaft that raised the coffin, and the man had been crushed by that very hellish elevator. One young officer turned away in horror and vomited. Another muttered a prayer. But the team leader just silently looked into the darkness behind the steel chamber, where a dried bloodstain seemed to have just spread. The investigation that followed left only details that no one wanted to imagine. The man, a scavenger who scavenged for scrap metal in abandoned buildings, had entered the old elevator system, a specialized mechanism for taking coffins from the basement to the chapel. He thought he had found a treasure trove of easily saleable scrap metal, but a single cut to the rotten cable was enough to awaken the death machine that had been dormant for years. The giant iron cage fell from the ceiling like the snout of a predator, closing with a metallic clang that echoed throughout the basement. No one heard the scream. No one knew that a human being was being swallowed by the very bowels of the building. He did not die immediately. He lived. 6 days. No food, no water, no light. There was only the sound of gasping, the sound of nails scraping metal, and a desperate look at the phone less than an arm's length away, just outside the bars. When the police found the body, the eyes were still wide open, the hand still reaching for the phone. On the floor, dried blood streaked. On the wall, scuff marks were scattered like the dead man's last desperate signs. What he had touched was not scrap metal, but the lid of his own coffin. The silent funeral home, which had seen hundreds of funerals, had become a giant coffin, burying an unknown death. No witnesses, no prayers, only the groaning of metal and the fading of breath in the pitch-black darkness. 6 days, 6 nights. The man struggled beneath the coffin lift, his arm reaching desperately for the phone that lay just out of reach, inches between life and death. April, trembling as she played back the footage she had captured, realized that her lens had not only captured an image, but had also inadvertently imprisoned something nameless, a soul, a presence, a pain that would never go away. From then on, the house was no longer a ruin, but a living tomb with a secret that would never rest. And if you're quiet enough, brave enough, standing in front of the hatch at 3 a.m., you'll hear groans, as if someone's still trying to crawl out of the bottom of the coffin. 6:30 p.m., May 14, 1955. Donald Jaru, 24, and Walter Murray Anderson, 28, two young Navy men just on leave, stood silently on the banks of Radium Springs, deep in the Georgia countryside. Before them the water glowed a brilliant blue, not the blue of life, but a cold, artificial light like a leak from the other world. It was a natural underground spring, tainted with radium, a radioactive element, once hailed as a medical miracle, now a quiet legacy of scientific recklessness. The light from the water did not reflect off the surrounding landscape. Instead, it swallowed the darkness, as if it were glowing on its own without a source of illumination. Donald glanced at Murray. "Did you see it, breathing?" Murray did not answer. He was staring down into the stream, where the light did not dissipate but spiraled in on itself, forming dark, opaque spirals, like eyes watching from below. No frogs, no crickets, no life, only a thick silence, an unnatural stillness not of nature, but of a forgotten place, or deliberately hidden. Suddenly a cold wind brushed the backs of their necks, but the water did not ripple. It did not move. Murray took a step back. Donald took a step forward. Radium Springs was still glowing, and it seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. Though they served in the U.S. Navy, Donald and Murray weren't looking for glory on the front lines. What they were chasing on their days off, a sense of the fine line between life and death. And they found it, underwater. There were no commercial devices in 1955. No one had taught them to dive. Instead, they made everything themselves out of sweat, intuition, and dangerous naivety. A homemade, makeshift, and reckless diving suit, an oxygen tank made from a lawn-mower's compressed air tank, a rubberized flashlight, waterproofed with candle wax and prayer, goggles made from a motorcycle windshield, and curved metal fins, sharp as knives, that rattled together like underwater coffins as they walked. No pressure gauges, no emergency equipment, no way back if they went wrong. They didn't call it suicide. They call it freedom. But Radium Springs doesn't care what they call it. The thing at the bottom of the spring doesn't distinguish between adventurers and fools. It just pulls down anyone foolish enough to get close. They clutched the makeshift diving line, a shaky, patched rope, the only thing that connected them to the surface, to life. White fingers clawed at the rough rope like drowning men clinging to rotting hope. They stood still. Neither spoke. Only the sound of labored breathing echoed through the opaque rubber masks. The water glowed coldly in the dying twilight, phosphorescent green like vampire blood. They descended step by step, their skin prickling as the heat drained the warmth from their bones. The goggles were fogged with hot, frightened breath, a mist inside, as if something were breathing back from the outside. No one said a last word. No one dared. Just the sound of water lapping against the two young bodies. And then they disappeared beneath the surface, as if Radium Springs had swallowed two souls without chewing. Minutes passed like time itself. They sank silently down 70 feet, where the light faded like the sun's last breath. No color, no shape, only black, thick black. Then it appeared, the mouth. Not a simple entrance, but a primordial crack in the earth, gaping, waiting since before man had known fear. A nameless, bottomless, echoless cavern. Its silence was not peaceful, it was desperate. like a scream muffled centuries ago. Donald and Murray stopped, their hearts pounding in their cold diving suits. They tightened their grip on the rope, not as if grasping for an escape, but as if clinging to a reality that was slowly cracking. Ahead, the darkness opened its mouth. Behind, the light died. And in the midst of it all, a silence that swallowed every plea. They crept in quietly, and the flashlight was swallowed up instantly, as if the darkness had weight, a mouth and hunger. Every rock face, every crack, was covered with a layer of mud and putrefaction, like the decay of time. A gentle flick of the propeller, and the world was gone. Everything blurred into a deadly silt rain, a suffocating fog where light had no place to cling. They were motionless in a shapeless, directionless space, trapped in a bottomless darkness. No idea where the ceiling was, where the bottom was. Only the sound of breathing, like the metallic screech of a skull. And then that feeling. Not fear, not yet. Just the knowledge that something was there, and it didn't come to be seen. It came to wait. Then suddenly the air surged like a reverse rain, thousands of bubbles pouring from Donald's tank, as frantic as if someone were strangling him from within. The sound was muted, but Donald's panicked eyes pierced the blackness, straight at Murray. Something's wrong. A muted explosion in their chests. Murray swam forward, but the water wasn't water anymore. It was thick as muddy lungs. Each slow kick like he was wrestling with the mouth of an invisible beast. Unable to speak, unable to see, Donald thrashed, and the breathing mask spat out desperate pulses. Bubbles surrounded him like the scales of a dying fish, but there was no shore. There was no way out, only panic swirling in a liquid tomb, where every movement was sucked back deeper, colder. And life was no longer an option. Donald knew, get out now, or die with the accident. The decision was electric leave. Fix it. Come back. His hand tightened on the lifeline. Each finger was frozen with cold and fear. He kicked hard. The thick water seemed to grip each kick like a corpse's hand. But Donald did not turn around. Murray remained. A final nod was exchanged. In the thick darkness and the pounding of his heart in his skull, Donald believed that Murray understood, that he would follow. But as Donald's flashlight faded into the depths, and there was only absolute silence, Radium Springs became what it was, a hungry mouth, devouring every promise. Donald tore through the lake like a fugitive from death, rising with a choked scream, his face pale, his eyes dilated as if still oppressed by the darkness. He spat violently, his breath torn to shreds. The flask hissed a death cry. He whirled to examine it, his fingers slick with cold water and blood from the cut in the metal strap. A joint loose, unnatural. He tightened it, each turn seeming to block the death that lurked in the depths. There was no time for fear. Murray was still down there, alone. Donald took a last breath as if he were about to fall to the bottom and plunged again, plunging into the inky depths where the light never reached. This time his will was not to live, but to not leave his friend in the tomb at the bottom of the world. Donald plunged down again, clutching the wire like a clinger to a fragile reality. The darkness swallowed the light from the surface, each meter of descent like shedding the skin of a living person. The flashlight flickered a faint glow in the demon's chest. Each kick stirred a thick rain of mud, as if the water were rotting around him. Absolute silence, no breathing, no time. Donald pressed deeper, fear running cold in his blood. What if Murray was no longer on the line? What if he was looking for a body, or worse, something else? He pressed on, though eyes fixed on nothingness, hands tightening on the coil of wire. each heartbeat a knock from beyond the grave. This was no longer an expedition. This was a mysterious summoning ritual, and Murray was an unanswered prayer. Inside, the fine mud stirred silently like a nightmare that refused to wake. It wrapped around Donald, tiny beads seeping through the cracks in his mask, cold as ash, sprinkled on living flesh. Inside, the fine mud stirred silently like a nightmare that refused to wake. It wrapped around Donald, tiny beads seeping through the cracks in his mask, cold as ash, sprinkled on living flesh. The surrounding stone walls weren't just closing in, they were pulsing, as if the cave had its own heartbeat. And Donald was the intruder pinned to its depths. He slid around every corner, eyes straining for Murray, but every turn opened only to darkness, as thick and silent as a tomb. No lights, no movement, no trace. The wire stopped after 200 feet tight, as the last nerve before snapping. No Murray, nothing. Then the sound, the faint, incoherent beep of the oxygen tank, like a knock on death's door. In the cramped space, Donald felt time dissolve, and a thought crossed his mind. Maybe he was stepping into a place where no man should go. Donald plunged into the cave like a madman, his hands groping in the thick mud mist, as if groping in an endless nightmare. Each time he swung his arms, mud and rocks rolled up, obscuring all directions. He pounded on the rock wall with both hands, a chill running down his spine every time he touched the smooth, silent moss surface. He shook each stone, turned over the underground gravel, hoping to find Murray's arm, a piece of cloth, or even a glimmer of a bubble. But there was only silence, a thick, deadly silence, drowning out all sound and reason. The pressure gauge began to beep faintly. The sound was small but resonant, like the countdown of death. Each beep was like a knife cutting deep into his mind. Donald raised his head. There was no light, just suffocating, heavy darkness. His breathing began to falter, his chest tightening as if it were being squeezed from within. Panic clawed at his mind. No time, no choice. He turned, kicked, and charged like a hunted man, ignoring the rocks that scratched his limbs. He didn't know where he was swimming, only that he had to get away. Adrenaline surged, pushing him through the bloody mist of water and fear. When the water broke above him, he emerged like a corpse, eyes wide, hands shaking, lungs exploding. But there was no cheer, no relief, just a cold twilight sky, and he was alone. Meanwhile, Murray, alone, lost, crept along the rope like a sleepwalker in the cold earth. The rope had been his hope, his escape, his everything. But then, at the end, it stopped. He floated in the water, his hands groping desperately. A careless turn, the rope slipped from his hands like a ghost vaporizing in the night. He jerked back, but the mud was rising, covering his mask like a thick rain of mud. All directions were meaningless. The flashlight, tiny, trembling, was swallowed by the mud. The air became as thick as liquid cement, deadly but silent. He pounded his fists against the walls, snaking through the suffocating nooks and crannies, trying to find his way back. But the walls seemed to shift, to close in, to breathe in time with the growing terror in his chest. The air was running out. Every breath became a bargain. Just a few steps from the rope, he didn't know if he had crossed it, or if it had retreated from him. Just a few steps, but the distance between life and the unknown abyss. And then it all closed, as if the cave never wanted him to leave. As dawn tore through the night, the rescue teams began silently plowing through the stream, the eerie blue water reflecting the light like dead flesh. They didn't say much, Just the sound of breathing tanks, the dragging of diving chains, and a cold feeling that gripped the back of their necks. Hours passed. Finally, they found Murray still, twisted in the thick mud of dried blood, less than an arm's length from the guide rope. His goggles were opaque, his eyes wide open, as if he were still trying to see the light that had betrayed him. Above him, the guide rope still dangling, indifferent as a hanging thread bobbed in the water. No one said anything. No one needed to. The cave had kept its promise. Only one man would return, and Radium Springs still glowing. Not because of radium, but because of things no one dared to name. What began as a thrill seeking plunge into radiant, unnatural waters devolved into a quiet nightmare. Their obsession with the unknown, their cobbled-together equipment tools of curiosity turned instruments of doom. The spring, lit with an eerie blue glow, was no mere wonder of nature. It was a mouth, patient, bottomless, waiting. Murray's death was not sudden. It was slow, creeping suffocation draped in silence, his mask fogging as he groped through blackness just inches from the line that could have saved him. The silt closed in like hands around his throat. Above him, the dive line swayed, gently oblivious, indifferent. Too late. The abyss didn't roar, didn't thrash. It simply opened and took.